There was one super weird announcement at WWDC this year, but I think I've worked out what's going on with the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. Whether it's unveiling the world's thinnest notebook from a manila envelope, or introducing a feature as mind-bendingly clever as universal control, Apple really does know how to take us all by surprise. However, sometimes the gang at Apple Park do so for the entirely wrong reason. This happened during the WWDC keynote a couple of weeks ago, among an avalanche of exciting new software updates, a brand new piece of Apple silicon, and inexplicably watchable slow-motion footage of Craig Federighi running, sat an announcement that has left everybody completely confused. It was the launch of the 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. Who is it for? Why is it still here? Who on earth is buying that laptop? I think I've worked it out. The M2 chip and the M2 MacBook Air were big surprises for me. As I'd noted several times in the lead up to WWDC this year, I genuinely thought we'd see that stuff later this year. Not so. The latest iteration of Apple Silicon and the next generation MacBook Air were clearly ready. And as it turns out, something else was ready too. As John Turnus strode slowly and confidently across the floor of one of Apple's many empty rooms, there's a distinct lack of furniture at Apple Park, isn't there? He revealed that the MacBook Air wasn't the only Mac that would receive the M2 chip this year. No, it would be joined by the world's second best-selling laptop, which is, unbelievably, the 13-inch MacBook Pro. That's right, Apple's latest, brightest, newest chip would be heading into the only MacBook Pro that has retained the Touch Bar and which features a design that is about 6 years old. Cue all of the internet completely losing its mind. What's going on? Why didn't they put that M2 chip in the 24-inch iMac instead? Where on earth is the Mac Mini? Surely it would have made more sense in one of those computers. As always, there's more to this than meets the eye. Back in February, I responded to a leak from Apple rumour mill veteran Mark Gurman. He'd revealed that a new entry-level MacBook Pro with an M2 chip would arrive later this year. Details were scarce, but he said it wouldn't feature ProMotion and also that it would finally do away with the Touch Bar. Okay, so he was slightly off with this one, but there's no doubting that that entry-level MacBook Pro he was referring to is this one. It sits beneath the 14-inch and 16-inch variants of the MacBook Pro in terms of specs and price bracketing, and is far more closely aligned with the new MacBook Air. But Gurman's report got me very excited back then. I noted that this theoretical entry-level MacBook Pro would have been the perfect machine for me 6 years prior. That was when I started my first business and I could only afford the horrible escape key edition of the MacBook Pro that was plagued by poor performance and that dreadful butterfly keyboard. But I bought it because I wanted a MacBook Pro, and that was the only MacBook Pro that I could afford. This, I think, is the reason Apple's keeping the 13-inch MacBook Pro within the lineup. But there's still more to this story. During WWDC, Apple told us that the 13-inch MacBook Pro is the world's second best-selling laptop. The best-selling laptop is the MacBook Air. Now that does seem quite unbelievable, and we do have to take their word for it. I'm sure it's based on some kind of metrics and sales figures. But that's why it's still on the shelves and why it's first to the post for the most important chip upgrades. Think about it. Apple is clearly selling these laptops by the bucket load. It's using a chassis that has been around since the big MacBook Pro design refresh of 2016. This means that every time one rolls off the production line, it's probably slightly more profitable. Who's buying them? I think the answer is right under your or my nose. As I mentioned earlier, it's people like my 6 years ago self. I would have snapped one of these up back then. This M2 MacBook Pro really is a little bit like that escape key version that I bought back then and which I limped along with during the early days of building my business. There's just one big difference. This version of the 13-inch MacBook Pro is knock your trousers off powerful. That's what makes it such a tempting proposition for buyers. It also carries the MacBook Pro name, and whether or not you think it deserves it is irrelevant because that's the product line within which Apple has placed it. And for many people, it's enough to draw their attention away from the M2 MacBook Air. I'd also guess that the 13-inch MacBook Pro is a hit with bulk buyers. Think about it, if you've got a room full of designers or developers, are you really going to spend a small fortune kitting them out with 14-inch MacBook Pros when such a capable 13-inch version exists? I think not. Apple is a business with very expectant shareholders. It needs to continually drive high profits and maintain steady growth. Products like the 13-inch MacBook Pro exemplify Apple's approach to the market and are the reason they're one of the most successful businesses of all time. To us, this laptop looks biblically stupid. It's weirdly close to the fanless and more desirable M2 MacBook Air, and if you spec it up, the far more capable 14-inch MacBook Pro is within grabbing distance. And it still has that touch bar. But Apple isn't thinking about the 13-inch MacBook Pro like we are. It is simply squeezing every last ounce of profit and market share from one of its best-selling laptops. Trust me, you would do the same. WWDC posed another great question. Is it a good idea to buy an M1 MacBook Air today, now that we have the M2 version? Keep watching for a link to a video I made recently where I definitively answer that question.